Chapter 8. Susan, the Sunday School Teacher. I knocked loudly on Stephen's door. There were no cars in the driveway aside from the caddy, but knowing Stephen, that didn't mean much. To my surprise, he was by himself. "Napping?" I asked, noticing the mussed shape of his hair. "Shut up," he said, closing the door behind me. He led me into the family room and laid down on the couch, flicking on the TV. I noticed a pile of white powder on top of a small mirror. "Busy day," I guessed. So-so," he replied, not taking his eyes off the television set. "Stephen," I said, "do you know if Adam ever went out with Destiny?" "My Destiny?" he asked, surprised. "Yeah." "I don't think so. Why?" I explained to him what had happened at Miriam's house, but all he said was, "She's wound up tightly with everything that's happened. I wouldn't put too much stock in anything she says." We watched a rerun of Let's Make a Deal, the old game show in which people dress up in costumes hoping to be noticed and given a shot at winning money and prizes. One of the contestants was a woman dressed as a devil. Just as the show came back from its second commercial break, we heard brakes screeching outside. I jumped up and peered out of the ornately decorated window. It was Dan, running from his Buick Regal towards Stephen's front door, clutching something close to his chest. Dan banged loudly against the door. Stephen swiftly ran downstairs and let him in. "Stephen," Dan said, stomping past him and into the house. Out of breath, he silently thrust an old black-and-white picture onto my hand. My face dropped. I showed it to Stephen, who practically grabbed it from me, examining it in amazement. It was an old black-and-white photograph of a girl lying in a casket, surrounded by an elaborate floral display. I realized this was a picture of a dead woman at her funeral. In Victorian times, it was customary to photograph the remains of the recently deceased in order to remember them before they were buried. As I analyzed the background, Stephen stared at the picture, his face twisted into a look of shock. "It can't be," he muttered. "The girl looks just like—" He trailed off. Then I realized. The girl in the picture looked exactly like Destiny. "This can't mean anything," Stephen insisted. "Where'd you find this picture?" I asked Dan. "I searched the public records at the public library for anything about Clara Bonney and found this article." He handed me a photocopy of a newspaper article from an early edition of the Lowell Sun. Stephen read it over my shoulder. "Apparently," Dan summarized, "Bonnie's husband wasn't just stabbed. He was cut into pieces. There wasn't much of an investigation, though, and it ended up being filed as an accident. But then I found that picture in an old police file. There's no date or name on the back, and no indication of who it was. I assumed it was one of Bonnie's victims." "You assume?" I asked, cocking one eyebrow.
"It's worked for us this far," Dan said, smiling. "Mass hallucinations," Stephen muttered.
"What?" I asked. "Mass hallucinations," Stephen continued, "like a mirage in the desert. We want to find connections so badly that we can't see reality. I think someone's tainted our drugs." "Well," I said, "I'll call Destiny anyway." I paused and looked for Stephen's reaction, but I'm not so sure that this girl has any relation to her. "You two do me a favor and try to find out more about Shamash." "I'll see what I can find online," Dan said triumphantly. I asked, "Stephen, have you had a chance to translate that page yet?" "Not yet. I was going to do it last night, but I had some unexpected company. I'll do it this morning." I knew what that meant. I thought of Mel Sweeney running out of Stephen's house days earlier. Stephen allowed his obsessions to overpower his thought process, but we all did. "All right, guys, we'll talk later." And with that, I left. Later on, I called Destiny, but she wasn't back from her mother's yet. I had begun to realize that my stash of H was becoming upsettingly low. I had bought the last of it before Woodstock and would have to re-up soon, otherwise I would be no good to anyone. My dealer was in Puerto Rico, which was why I had bought a large amount before we left. I used to be a social user, if there is such a thing, but from my behavior over the past weeks, I knew I had lost control. How had this all begun? I remember my first time getting high. It was with Adam and Dan. Dan had smoked pot a couple days before, and he swore that it brought him closer to the gods than fasting or spells ever could. At this, we decided we would try it before performing a spell. Adam had bought a dime bag from a school friend, and the plan had been for Adam and me to meet up with Dan after school. Dan was supposed to show up at Adam's house at around 2, but an hour later, Dan was still nowhere to be found. Eventually, he did show up about 45 minutes later, stumbling down the street, brandishing a black eye. "Damn Matt Bucci," he said, meaning the school bully. Bucci had repeated 8th grade because he failed math and English, so he tried to make everyone else in our school miserable. Matt used to call me a fag because he knew it pissed me off. Something had to be done. We decided then and there that we would partake of the herb and then perform a spell to bind Matt Bucci. Soon, the three of us were sitting in a circle in Adam's backyard. We tried to roll the weed into a joint, but quickly realized that none of us possessed that ability. Adam made a makeshift bowl out of a pipe he found in his shed, and we passed it around.
After a few minutes, the high set in.
We began to perform the spell to bind Matt to the Lowell General Hospital. Adam had discovered this particular ritual in the writings of Ebenezer Sibley. We didn't want to kill Matt, just make him think twice about his behavior. Besides, 24 hours in a hospital bed could give him a new perspective on life. The spell required us to light a fire using only white oak wood, murder a pigeon and remove its heart, cut the bruised skin around Dan's eye, and tie a ribbon around a picture of Matt. Then we were told to throw all 3 items in the fire to be sent up to the gods. It took a couple of hours to perform the spell correctly. We found the pigeon, easily enough, in a market basket parking lot a short walk from Adam's house. Really, the hardest part was getting Dan to let us cut a little bit of skin from around his bruised eye. Afterwards, we all got hungry, so we decided to go back to Adam's house and raid his fridge. The next day at school, we discovered that Matt's father had been rushed to Lowell General Hospital for a severe heart attack. Matt wasn't in school because he was at the hospital with his dad. The spell had worked, but not in the way we intended. Matt's dad died the next day. We were astonished, understanding that we had stumbled onto something powerful. We continued to use grass ritualistically until Dan was turned on to stronger hallucinogens by one of his hippie friends. We all soon came to the conclusion that there was an inherent power behind the little squares of blotter paper and in the colorful caps of the mushrooms we ingested. We began using hallucinogens before every holy day and in our Sabbath activity. Before long, Dan started using them almost daily, maintaining a comprehensive schedule that detailed which drugs he could use on which days to achieve their maximum effect. Shortly after we discovered hallucinogens, we let Stephen join our coven. We had gone to church with him years before, and it was well known around town that he was into brutal sex magic and hard drugs. My own ascent into hard drugs started off by occasionally doing Special K with Brandy, my girlfriend at the time. After that, I began ritualistically experimenting with cocaine with Stephen. Stephen loved the feeling of coke, but I was indifferent to it. Sometimes I enjoyed it, but it mostly gave me horrible anxiety and made me paranoid as hell. It wasn't until Stephen introduced me to another sacred substance before a dark, orgiastic ritual that I found my drug of choice. He called it dragon dust. Stephen claimed it was the same substance the ancient Chinese magician used in their magical practices. It was only later that I found out the drug was commonly known as heroin. Everyone in our coven would use heroin before performing our darkest ritual on Samhain, the most holy day of the year. No one in our coven seemed to enjoy it very much. Dan would always throw up shortly after doing it. Adam didn't like to use any drugs socially aside from pot. Destiny always acted the same, regardless of the drug she did. I loved it, though. I started as a social heroin user and limited it to the weekends. In my defense, I was able to maintain this for several years, but as of late, I've started using it more and more. Now with Adam gone, it had become my only solace and refuge from my pain. Returning to my current dilemma, I began to assess the situation. My only choice was to go to downtown Lowell and begin the dreadful process of asking a homeless person to score some smack for me. This was always dangerous, because junkies were constantly stealing people's money or selling them fake drugs. I knew, though, that the best place to score was at the homeless shelter off of Market Street, because, interestingly enough, that was where many drug dealers could be found. The number of homeless people in Lowell was astounding. I found that most people became homeless because they got addicted to illegal substances such as heroin, crack, or were just non-functioning alcoholics. The catch-22 of a homeless shelter is that it attracts prostitution and drug dealers seeking to help the homeless feed their habits. It was a vicious cycle that I had managed to avoid. As I pulled up to the homeless shelter, I saw Susan, Destiny's mother, on the corner. I parked my car and got out, partly out of fear of being arrested for soliciting a prostitute. "Hey, Susan," I said, smiling, but quickly saw that she was out of it. Scantily clad, Destiny's mother had obvious track marks on her arms. Her hair was a mess, and she looked at me out from under her short black hair. I called out again by her real name, which must have thrown her off. She didn't seem to recognize me at first, but soon smiled. "Hi, Jeff," she said through gritted teeth. Her makeup was hastily done, her lipstick painted heavily over the cold sores that surrounded her lips. I looked her up and down, noticing that she would be kind of pretty if she were to clean herself up. "You got a cigarette for an old friend?" she slurred. "For you?" I said teasingly. "Anything." "Thanks, love," she responded, rubbing up to me as she took my lighter. "Oh, Jeff, what brings you out here? Not a social call, I assume?" "Not today, Susan." "What can I help you with?" "I need a finger," I replied, using the lingo to denote that I needed 10 grams of heroin. "Well, then," she said, "what will I get in return?" Jokingly, I responded, "A fingernail." She didn't get it. We walked down to the Jay's convenience store, where she called her connection on a payphone covered in graffiti. I was relieved when I saw Susan on the corner, because it meant I wouldn't get robbed or hustled. She was a mess, that much was sure, but she would never rob me, being that I was friends with her daughter. No matter how far down the ladder she fell, she still loved her daughter, and tried her best to not do anything that would upset Destiny, aside from the obvious. As I sat there listening to Susan make the call and haggle with her dealer over the price, my mind went back to 10 years before, when she was my Sunday school teacher. I remembered a specific lesson she taught about Matthew 18, something about being bound on earth and heaven. What a long way we'd all come. She hung up the phone and turned to me. "It's going to be about 15 minutes, but we can wait in my friend's apartment until then," she said, reaching into her bag and retrieving a key. I followed her, making small talk as she greeted her various friends along the way. When we got in the tiny studio apartment, we sat at a beaten-up table with several mismatched chairs surrounding it. The hole-in-the-wall apartment contained only a mattress on the floor and a small TV on a 3-legged end table. I lit a cigarette and handed it to her before lighting one for myself. "So," I said, trying to make conversation, "how was your visit with Destiny?" Susan stared at the floor. "It went all right. I hate that she can't live with me, but it's not like I can blame the courts," she said, gazing at her bruised arms. "I know," I said, thinking about my own issues with the same substance. Then I thought of the picture with Adam. "You don't remember Destiny ever mentioning a kid named Adam to you at all?" I asked quietly. "Adam," she grunted under her breath. "Yeah, I remember him. The abusive jerk. Not recently," I added abruptly. "It would have been back when we were all in the 8th grade. "Oh, I know who you are talking about," she said with an angry look on her face. "The poet." She gently fingered her track marks up and down her arms, finally saying, "This shit has made me forget a lot of things. But that's one I remember. Did you know she lost a baby because of him?" "Baby?" I said, now confused. "Yeah, and let me tell you one thing," she said, leaning in close to me. "She said she fell down the stairs. But I know the truth." She pointed her fingers over her head, clearly implying devil horns. "A mother always knows," she said, while she put out her cigarette in a small aluminum ashtray sitting on the table. A loud buzzing noise broke my trance, and she got up and shouted into the intercom. Our connection had arrived. I gave her the money, and she ran downstairs to meet the dealer. She came back grinning. I took the cellophane off of my cigarette pack, filled it with some of the brown powder, then gave it to her. Then I poured out a large line for myself. Susan ran into the bathroom. I wanted to talk more about Adam, but when she came out, she wasn't in the mood to talk. In fact, she could barely keep her eyes open. I laid her on the mattress and poured a little more powder on the table so she would have a little something for when she woke up. Then I left the grungy little apartment. As I walked back to my car by the homeless shelter, I saw an old man in tattered clothes looking through a garbage can for refundable cans. He pushed a shabby grocery cart. I just couldn't picture Adam as being abusive. I thought that maybe I was searching for something better left unknown. Maybe Adam was abusive, and I'd been too close to him to see his faults. I felt bad for Destiny, wondering how she could stand the abuse from Stephen and the degrading things he did to her, that we all did to her, at our rituals. My mind instantly went back to the picture I had seen earlier. A lifeless body, identical to hers, lying in a casket. For a brief moment I thought that maybe I had died instead of Adam. I kept thinking about all I'd seen, events that were too close to one another to be coincidences, but too disparate to be obvious clues. I felt like I was in purgatory, trying to solve a mystery without end. Chapter 9. Youth Group from Hell. When I arrived at Stephen's house, he was pulling out of his driveway. I rolled down my window to talk to him and signaled for him to do the same. "Where are you headed?" I yelled. "I'm going to the Faith Baptist Youth Group," he mumbled under his breath, hoping I wouldn't catch what he had said. He was wrong. "Are you kidding me?" I said, laughing. "You didn't even like going to youth group when your father made you." "Mel's going to be there," he said, and began rolling his window back up. I had so much to tell him, but I could see that he would not be stopped. "Hold on a second," I yelled, and parked in front of him on the side of the street. Jumping out of my car, I ran to his passenger side door, which he unlocked reluctantly. "I'm going with you," I said, jumping in and adjusting the seat. Stephen sighed and started the car. "What'd the grimoire say?" I asked as we pulled onto the main drag. "The first part was in Aramaic," Stephen said, as he reached into a bag lying next to me and fished out a Scooby-Doo notebook with the translated text written in blue ink. "The rest is similar to Aramaic, but I couldn't translate it. I think it may be in Iblate." I read the translated portion. Shamash helped him. Shamash set him on a large throne of gold. He showed him how to observe oil on water, a secret of Anu, Enlil, and Ea. He gave him a divine tablet, the Kibdu, a secret of heaven and earth. He put in his hand a cedar instrument, a favorite of the great gods. He taught him how to make calculations with numbers. He learned Savant, who guards the secrets of the great gods, will bind his favorite heir with an oath before Shamash. By the divine tablets with a stylus he will instruct him in the secrets of the gods. The three who to heaven ascended. Thus was the line of priests created, those who are allowed to approach Shamash. "Who's the favorite heir? What does this all mean?" I wondered aloud. "Beats the hell out of me," Stephen said. "It's probably just the ramblings of a crazy old lady." I thought about it. There must be some connection between Iblate script, Shamash, binding, and cutting, but I was in no state to figure it out right away. "What happened with Destiny?" Stephen asked. "I couldn't get in touch with her." "Probably a coincidence anyway," he said confidently, but I wasn't sure that he was right. Oh, Dan called his sister today to talk about some family stuff. She said that the investigation had been closed. As sad as this news was, it did provide me with some closure. I began to debate whether or not I should tell Stephen about Destiny and Adam. I decided that I needed to for the sake of our investigation. "Stephen," I said, my voice neutral. "Yeah?" "Do you ever wonder about Adam? That maybe he wasn't as nice a person as we thought?" I said. "Nah, Jeff," Stephen said, not even considering the possibility. "Adam was a good friend. He would do anything for any of us." "Yeah," I said, "maybe you're right. But listen, I have to tell you something I found out, and you may not like it." "What?" he said, and I could tell he was interested. "Adam and Destiny had a relationship in the 8th grade, I said plainly. Stephen looked at me, his eyebrow cocked. "So?" "So, I thought you would be mad." "I'm not mad. It was junior high. Everybody dated everybody. It doesn't matter to me." "Oh," I said, realizing that this news was not as devastating as I had thought. Feeling more confident, I dropped the other bombshell. She was also pregnant with his kid. "Shit," Stephen said sharply, as if he'd been cut with a razor. We turned into the parking lot at our old church. "We started to learn all these new things about Adam that we never knew before," I said. "Maybe Adam did have secret connections to Shamash or Nimrod or whoever the hell he was. Maybe Bonnie is involved. Maybe not. These dots are too hard to connect." Stephen stayed silent and began to open his door. When he was halfway out of the car, he said, "I've been going through everything in my mind over and over again. The picture, the grimoire, the agents at Adam's house. But I need a break. Adam was one of my very best friends, and nothing can make me feel otherwise." He paused. "Are you coming in, Jeff?" he asked, now looking through the window at me. I shook my head. With that, Stephen entered the church. I waited in the car and turned the radio on to some classical music station. I looked around for a flat surface where I could snort some heroin. I glanced at the back seat and I discovered a small, beaten-up Bible. I opened it, and the inscription jumped out at me. It read, "To my little angel Stephen, your father and mother love you so much. Remember, sin will keep you from this book, and this book will keep you from sin. May you grow up to know the love of the Lord. May this book always be your foundation. I love you always. Love, Mommy." I had to fight to keep the tears from welling up in my eyes. Stephen's mother had bought him this little Bible before he was born. I opened to a random page and did my line, soon entering a deep trance. I pictured the suited officers from Adam's house in ancient gold armor. They were standing inside the Pentacle of Shamash and chanting loudly. The soldiers formed a circle, while a man in makeup chopped at a naked woman. Abruptly, I was awoken by the sound of Pastor Smythe tapping on the passenger side window. I sat up straight and rolled the window down. "Jeff," he said, with a warm look of sympathy, "is everything all right?" I didn't say anything. I just sat there and looked forward, avoiding his eyes. The pastor waited a moment for me to speak, then continued. "Yesterday you burst into my office demanding to know about Shamash and ancient Sumerian demonology. Now I find you sleeping in the church parking lot. What's going on with you?" "I'm fine," I said, not even convincing myself, but shrugging off his attempt to find out what was wrong with me. "Mikey called me. He said that you, Dan, and Stephen have been acting funny lately. In fact, it looks like you haven't slept in days. I talked to Dan today. He called asking about Shamash. He tried to pretend it wasn't him, saying that he was a member of Biblical Archaeology Review, but I could tell." I shrugged. "I am not sure what's going on, but I'm suspicious that you guys have invented a story to give Adam's death some greater meaning. I know that some of the events around his death were mysterious, but Jeff," he said, catching my attention, "there's no equation that will bring him back. He's dead. Now, if you want to come inside, I can—" "Hey, Pastor Smythe," Stephen interrupted as he walked out of the church, smiling broadly. The pastor eyed him suspiciously. "What are you guys talking about?" Stephen said, his voice mocking our conversation. "Nothing, Stephen," the pastor replied. "Remember what I said, okay, Jeff?" I nodded, and he turned to walk inside the church. "What a dick," Stephen said as he jumped in the car. "Nah," I said, "he's not that bad." "Mel's meeting at my house in 30 minutes, so—" He let the word linger. "That's all right," I replied. "I'm going to go visit Destiny." "Cool, man. Keep her busy for me," Stephen said. I didn't realize the sexual innuendo in his words until later. For the rest of the ride, Stephen told me about a 19th-century doctor named MacDougall. Supposedly, he would measure the weight of recently deceased tuberculosis patients to prove that they had a soul. I wasn't really paying close attention, though. I started to think of the God of the Bible and how he had murdered his son. He was an all-powerful God, yet he killed his only child. I tried to picture Adam aborting his own offspring. Oh, wouldn't it be great if there was a better reason for Adam to have killed his own baby? I was about to find that there were darker reasons behind the murder of my friend's unborn child. Chapter 10. A Date with Destiny. Destiny's foster home was your typical split-level suburban house with a white picket fence. The Levasseurs appeared at first glance to be an ideal Leave-It-to-Beaver family, but we had all seen past that charade long ago. Destiny's foster mother, Betty, answered the door and quietly ushered me inside. Betty always seemed to be frightened. A tall woman with long brown hair and a wide nose, her husband forbade her to wear makeup, so she always seemed so plain. Her face was thin, and in certain lights she looked like a skeleton. Stephen used to tease Destiny that she was the adopted daughter of Skeletor. Betty had a very subservient attitude that made her an ideal wife for Peter, Destiny's foster dad. Peter was a deacon at the Faith Baptist Church, the same church where Smythe was pastor. When he wasn't performing his church duties, Peter was an abusive, overbearing jerk. He beat his wife, and he had beaten Destiny many times before she started going with Stephen. Betty brought me upstairs. Destiny was in the bathroom, but her mom said she'd be right out. Peter must have been away on business, I suspected. I thanked Betty, and she slowly made her way down the staircase. As I sat in Destiny's room, I noticed that the room hardly resembled the personality of the Destiny I knew. Judging from the room and the posters on the wall, one would assume that the occupant had her life together. I figured, given the opportunity, that Destiny would likely change her room drastically. I noticed something sticking out from the box spring under her mattress. I wasn't sure what it was, so I pulled at it. It was a small, ornate box, which looked to be very old. Its lid was adorned with a large ruby surrounded by more cut yellow stones than I could count. In my mind, a library of images showed me that this was a variation of Adam's Pentacle, or at least it could be. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the box. Inside was an old picture of Destiny as a child, with her biological mother and father holding her. All three were smiling. The mother in the picture was hardly the Susan I had seen earlier, but the Susan from my memory. Susan, our Sunday school teacher. She was beautiful. Under the picture were several brittle pieces of paper folded in quarters. I flattened them out and discovered that they seemed to be instructions for using a voodoo doll, complete with body parts with numbers on them. A correct way of assembling them appeared to be written at the bottom of the pages, but I couldn't be sure. Then I saw a word in Hebrew, shamash. At least that's what I thought I read. Ancient Hebrew didn't use any vowel marks, which made translation difficult, especially because of my very limited understanding of the language. These pages had been ripped out of an old book. Instantly, I thought of the grimoire. But how could Destiny have gotten it? The book was buried deep underground, and the dirt wasn't fresh. There was no way she could have dug it up before us or removed it afterwards. The truth then hit me. Someone else, who had known of Witch Bonnie, must have given it to her. I heard Destiny coming up the stairs and quickly placed the pages back in the box, stuffed the box back into the box spring, and sat on her bed. Destiny closed the door as she quietly entered the room. She wore a long, loose dress that was hardly flattering to her figure. Without a word, she slipped it off, revealing a tight black leather top and no underwear. She reached behind me and grabbed a vicious-looking dildo from her drawer. This was not strange. She and I had had relations several times, but only during spells, and then only when Stephen was around. I realized that Stephen had likely called her and told her to be nice to me. I figured she assumed I was here for some S&M. I excused myself, saying that I had just stopped by to tell her to meet everyone tomorrow night at the barn. I tried not to show my suspicion, but was pretty sure it was plain on my face. As I left, I didn't turn around to see her reaction, just ran straight to my car. I wasn't sure what to make of what I had just seen. Did the page really say Shamash? It could have just as easily have said Shamish, the Hebrew word for sun. What about the box? Was it possible that it was just some antique picture of a flower? All of these twisted ideas swam through my mind as I drove to Dan's house. The pages couldn't be from the same grimoire. There's no way in hell she could have gotten those pages without someone noticing. She had been with us when we found the book, and while we had examined it immediately, she never held it. I stopped in at Dan's to find him painting one of his favorite things, an image from the Book of Maccabees, a grotesque image of a woman with her dead baby hanging from her own neck. I told him what I'd found at Destiny's. "Jeff," he said, cutting me off, "I've been thinking a lot about these Guardians of Light that Pastor Smythe mentioned. Maybe those were the FBI agents at Adam's house." I agreed, saying that I had been contemplating the same idea. Though we were grief-stricken over our lost friend, we decided to make a list to solve this mystery. "So, what do we know for sure?" I asked Dan, with pen and paper in hand. "Adam killed himself while performing some sort of spell. The spell included some Eblate script. The spell used an ancient Pentacle, associated with the sun god Shamash. This same spell was found in Bonnie's grimoire, which, incidentally, you believe was at some point in Destiny's possession," Dan said slowly as I scribbled the words. I circled the name Destiny. "And she's our only lead at this point." "Is she still at her house?" Dan asked. "I think so," I replied. We were getting ready to leave when Stephen burst through the door. "What's up?" Dan asked. "Where are you guys going?" Stephen demanded. "We're going to talk to Destiny," I said defiantly. "Me too," Stephen said. "I wanted to come get you guys, but I see that you have already figured it out." Dan and I looked at each other. "Figured what out?" I asked. "That everything points to Destiny," he said as he examined the list on the table. "There's no way around it. Destiny must die." At first I thought he was joking, but I saw how gravely serious he was. "I've been reading the text of the grimoire over and over again," Stephen began. "It mentions certain numbers and calculations. Remember Adam's walls? Remember how those agents covered Adam's walls with white paint? Adam must have figured out the secret of heaven and earth, the Kibdu. It's all in the text I translated. I think Destiny killed Adam. I think she killed him because he was the favored heir. I think that Destiny is going to cut up Adam in an attempt to replace him as the favored heir, the same way Witch Bonnie did to her husband, and the same way the Semiramis did to Nimrod. Destiny's going to dig up Adam's remains and scatter them throughout Lowell." This was too much, even for Stephen. "Are you serious?" I said, unable to believe his words. "It all makes sense, Jeff," Stephen said, now getting animated. "These women kill the heirs, and afterwards they do horrible things. Semiramis was the first initiator of child sacrifice, and Witch Bonnie, we know, did horrible things with little children." "What are you saying?" Dan interrupted loudly. Stephen's expression got very sober. "I talked to my mother last night." "Stephen," I said, convinced he was out of his mind, "your mother's dead."
"I know that," he said, looking at the floor. "But I had this vision last night. It felt so real. I was outside, and Adam was trying to shoot some demon with a rifle. It was a big, ferocious demon with long horns, giant leather wings, and huge claws. I saw Adam trying to kill it, but I was tired, so I could only go to my house and go to sleep. When I woke up, I could hear someone shooting a gun. I could also hear my mom talking with Adam. I went out to see them, and on my way out, I noticed that my dog had died." He went on. "I got up there, and the beastly demon was flying around like a bat, so I impaled it with my athame. Then I took out 4 tiny knives and stuck them in the beast in the form of a cross. I went back to my house and saw my room. She looked just like she does in the picture my dad showed me. She was beautiful. She told me, 'Stephen, Angel, you are a soldier of light. That means you have to kill your own demons.' I realized Adam and my mother are watching over me until my purpose has been completed. When I woke up, I realized we have to avenge the heir." "And this translates into murdering Destiny? Can you even hear yourself right now?" I asked him. "I'm going with or without you," Stephen said, making his way to the door. I began to consider my options. Destiny had become Stephen's scapegoat. Once she was gone, everything in Stephen's universe would be made right again, but it would not bring Adam back. I could see that Stephen was impatient. It was not unusual for him to make impulsive decisions, or even death threats, but it wasn't like him to be irrational. So I thought it would be best to go with him and try to talk him out of killing her. Dan was stupefied, and I could tell that he didn't know what to say. I grabbed my hooded sweatshirt, and we followed Stephen to his car. I thought Stephen was probably just upset that Adam and Destiny had a kid that he never knew about, and this was his way of coping with the emotional strain. I figured he would be fine once he talked to Destiny. Even so, it made me nervous that he still had his athame on him. We visited Destiny's foster home first. All we heard when we knocked at the front door was a man grunting like a pig and Destiny's stepmother screaming in agony. Dan and I were concerned, but Stephen assured us they were just having sex. "He's a nasty cunt," Stephen said. I looked at him, surprised, and he seemed to know what my look meant. "Fine, so am I, but that's beside the point." Stephen suggested we drive to Adam's grave, since he had expected that Destiny would be there hacking our friend's body to pieces. When we got there, we found Adam's grave undisturbed. "Happy now?" Dan asked Stephen, but Stephen only mocked him as we got back into the car. Next, we decided to look for Destiny's real mother on the sad streets of broken-down Lowell, but we found nothing. On our way back to Dan's house, we headed over the dangerous bridge, the bridge that connected downtown Lowell to the slum area. My mother had always called it the dangerous bridge because of how the road was a giant iron gate, and if you stopped your car and opened your door, you could see the water through the road. We got stuck at the light at the end of the bridge. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure dressed in black racing down the sidewalk, but Dan and Stephen didn't seem to notice. Since the university was nearby, I figured it was just some Gothic student running late for class, but on a hunch, I jumped out of the car. Running across the flow of traffic, I was sure my abruptly exiting the car left my friends confused. As I got closer to the figure, I could tell by her walk that it was Destiny. She turned around, and our eyes met. She quickly ran away, but not before I could tell that she was crying. I heard the sound of a car door slamming shut behind me, and out jumped Stephen, who also began to run after Destiny. What was he thinking, I thought, as I chased after her. As she sped up, something dropped to the ground. Destiny neared the end of the sidewalk. The rest of the sidewalk was under construction and was blocked off by a large gate. I could tell that Destiny had 3 options. She could stop, step out into the oncoming traffic, or jump off the bridge. She turned around at the gate to see me running at her from one end of the bridge and Stephen running towards her from the other end. I strained myself harder, trying to reach her before Stephen could. Then she yelled out, "I'm sorry," and flung herself off the bridge. I ran to the spot where Destiny had jumped, and seconds later Stephen caught up with me. We stared off the bridge with morbid fascination, looking at the rocks below. I pointed out her body, which was twisted into a grotesque shape, with blood gathering around her head. As her lifeless eyes stared up at us, she looked almost peaceful. We could hear sirens in the distance. Apparently, someone among the crowd that had gathered had called the police. Stephen looked like he was going to be sick. I picked my way back to Dan's car, grabbing what Destiny had dropped. It was the same picture of her and Adam that we'd seen on Dan's acid. It must have been her copy, I thought, as I showed Stephen the picture. He smiled. A cruiser showed up almost immediately, and we spent the next few hours at the police station filling out witness reports. We all agreed to leave out the part where Stephen had been on his way to kill Destiny. "A minor detail," Stephen urged. "Brought on by grief," Dan concluded. The police almost immediately ruled Destiny's death a suicide. This time there were no mysterious suited agents. If they had come, they would have found Destiny's ambivalent foster parents eager to give away all of her possessions. I knew they would just throw it in the trash anyway. I heard from an old friend that the Levasseurs had adopted another foster child about a year after Destiny's death. I figured that they needed to make up for the loss of the support check from Uncle Sam that had covered Destiny. This time, the child was much younger, and likely far easier for Peter Levasseur to control and abuse. After Destiny's death, all the strange coincidences began to fade from my mind, and my life began to return to normal. Whatever secret bond that existed between Adam and Destiny had been taken to the grave, or so we all thought.